In the great geopolitical war of the 21st century, Crimea is no longer just a peninsula, it is the blood-stained crown of an empire. Black Sea storms rage as missiles streak from Crimean bases, lighting burning skies over Sevastopol's fortified naval base packed with Russian warships. Radar stations scan endlessly. The peninsula feels mythological and impregnable. Whoever controls Crimea controls the Black Sea's military and psychological balance. For Putin, it is legitimacy. For Ukraine, it is survival. How do you defeat a fortress like that? And that question may already be answered by a strategy to slowly suffocate it. For the Kremlin, Crimea is not merely territory, it is political immortality. In 2014, the annexation triggered explosive patriotic celebrations across Russia. Russian flags waved in every city, nationalist pride surged, and Putin's approval ratings skyrocketed. What had been a mere peninsula suddenly became the emotional symbol of a restored Russian empire. In a single move, Putin transformed himself from a calculating president into the imperial restorer, the leader who brought glory back to the motherland. Strategically, Crimea delivers far more than symbolism. It grants Russia naval dominance in the Black Sea, advanced missile launch capabilities, control over vital shipping routes, direct access toward the Mediterranean, and constant pressure on Odessa and southern Ukraine. Yet its true value is deeper. Crimea became the crown that transformed Putin into the man who restored Russia. Losing it could destroy the mythology that has protected his power for more than a decade. If the crown falls, Putin's myth cracks, the Russian public faces psychological shock, and the entire imperial narrative that sustains the regime could collapse. But for Ukraine, Crimea represents something far darker. For Ukraine, Crimea is not a trophy. It is a loaded gun pointed directly at the country's heart. From Crimean bases, Russia can launch caliber missiles deep into Ukrainian territory, strike Kyiv within minutes, dominate the entire southern coastline, exert constant pressure on Odessa, and threaten vital logistics routes. The peninsula has turned the Azov Sea into a strategic prison, restricting Ukraine's access to the sea and choking its economic lifelines. As long as the Black Sea Fleet remains anchored in Sevastopol, Ukraine lives under permanent threat. Every peace agreement signed while this fortress exists risks becoming nothing more than a pause before the next invasion. As long as the shadow of the Black Sea Fleet remains over Crimea, every peace agreement risks becoming only an intermission before another invasion. Ukraine can never feel truly safe while this Russian fortress sits on its southern flank. And perhaps that is what makes Crimea so different from every other battlefield in this war. Because Crimea is no longer just about territory. It has become the place where military power, political legitimacy, national identity, and global strategy all collide at once. So tell me, do you think this war can truly end while Crimea remains under Russian control? And that is why some Western strategists stopped asking how to storm Crimea and started asking how to slowly strangle it instead. The most effective way to destroy a fortress is often not to attack the walls, but to cut the arteries behind them. Former U.S. Army commander in Europe, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, has proposed a powerful strategy of strategic suffocation instead of a direct frontal assault on Crimea. Rather than storming the heavily fortified peninsula, the idea is to slowly isolate and weaken it until it becomes unsustainable. Ukraine is focusing on the Kerch Bridge, the narrow M14 land corridor, and maritime interdiction. By targeting these supply lines, Crimea can be turned from a fortress into an isolated island. A fortress without logistics eventually becomes a prison for the soldiers trapped inside it. Day after day, Ukrainian FPV drones and drone swarms hunt Russian positions. Radar stations and prized S-400 air defense systems are being systematically destroyed. The skies over Crimea have become a psychological nightmare for Russian troops, who now live under constant threat from above. Ukraine may not need to destroy every Russian soldier in Crimea. It may only need to make life there psychologically unbearable. Simultaneous strikes on Russian refineries, fuel depots, and logistics hubs are draining the resources needed to sustain the occupation. Without reliable fuel and funding, the entire military machine in Crimea begins to weaken. This is not just another military campaign. This strategy attacks logistics, morale, economy, sustainability, and psychology all at once. It transforms Crimea into a giant pressure chamber. And this may be the terrifying evolution of modern siege warfare. Because Ukraine may no longer be trying to conquer Crimea quickly. It may instead be transforming the peninsula into a giant strategic pressure chamber, one that slowly drains Russian fuel, money, morale, logistics, and political stability over time. And if you're still watching this story, it's probably because this no longer feels like a traditional battlefield. It feels like the slow exhaustion of an empire itself. And the consequences of that strategy may already be shaking the foundations of Russia's military system. The more desperately Moscow tries to protect Crimea, the weaker the rest of Russia's war machine may become. Faced with relentless Ukrainian strikes, the Russian Black Sea Fleet has been forced into a historic humiliation, a large-scale withdrawal from its main base in Sevastopol. This marks one of the most significant naval strategic retreats in generations, a bitter reversal for a fleet once dominant in the region. The humiliation of the Black Sea Fleet is not merely a tactical setback, it is a fundamental rewriting of naval warfare rules. For centuries, dominance in these waters required massive steel hulls and heavy naval artillery. Today, Ukraine, a nation without a functional conventional navy, has neutralized Russia's maritime supremacy using a swarm of low-cost, explosive sea drones and Western-supplied cruise missiles. This asymmetric warfare has effectively forced Russia's billion-dollar warships to hide in distant ports, lifting the naval blockade on Ukrainian grain corridors without firing a single traditional broadside. The implications stretch far beyond the shores of Sevastopol. Naval strategists worldwide are watching Crimea, realizing that the era of uncontested surface fleet dominance is over. By turning the Black Sea into a deadly no-go zone for the Kremlin, Ukraine has proved that control over a maritime fortress depends not on the size of your fleet, but on your ability to deny the enemy the freedom to sail. Crimea, once the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Russian Empire, is now vulnerable from the very waters it was meant to conquer. To shield Crimea, Russia is now rushing critical resources southward: advanced S-400 air defense systems, elite combat brigades, logistics units, and additional air defenses. These reinforcements come at a heavy cost. The more Moscow pours into defending the peninsula, the thinner its lines become on other critical fronts, especially around Donetsk, Pokrovsk, and the southern battlefield. Crimea is slowly transforming from Russia's greatest strategic trophy into one of its most dangerous strategic liabilities. Instead of serving as a launchpad for Russian power, it has become a strategic black hole sucking in men, weapons, and supplies that are desperately needed elsewhere. Russia now finds itself overstretched, forced to defend too many strategic zones at the same time. And the consequences of Crimea's fate extend far beyond Russia and Ukraine themselves. The future of Crimea may shape far more than the Black Sea. The fate of this peninsula ripples across the global economy. Disruptions in Ukrainian grain exports from the region have already triggered spikes in world food prices. Maritime routes through the Black Sea remain volatile, affecting energy logistics and international shipping. What happens in Crimea directly influences bread prices in Africa, energy costs in Europe, and stability in global food markets. Inside Russia, the consequences are even more painful. Once marketed as a sunny tourist paradise, Crimea has transformed into a militarized fear zone. Luxury properties are collapsing in value, civilians are fleeing, and mobilization anxiety grips local communities. What was meant to be a showcase of Russian revival now breeds economic decline and quiet resentment. Beneath the Kremlin's defiant rhetoric, the psychological toll of the Crimean siege is beginning to fracture the domestic illusion of safety. For a decade, the Russian public was sold a promise that the annexation of Crimea was a permanent, bloodless victory, a done deal sealed by history. But as air defense sirens regularly wail over Sevastopol beaches and smoke rises from burning ammunition dumps, that illusion is evaporating. The peninsula is no longer a symbol of effortless imperial pride. It has become a domestic anxiety engine, Every explosion on the Kerch Bridge echoes directly into the living rooms of Moscow and St. Petersburg, whispering a dangerous truth that state television cannot censor. The state can no longer guarantee the security of its most prized trophy. This realization breeds a quiet, insidious fatigue among the Russian populace. When the crown jewel of an empire requires a constant sacrifice of sons and resources just to stay attached, the average citizen begins to question the cost of the emperor's ambition. The geographic isolation of Crimea is slowly translating into a psychological isolation for the regime itself. On the world stage, the struggle over Crimea tests something deeper. It challenges the Budapest Memorandum and asks whether nations that give up nuclear weapons can truly trust international guarantees. If Ukraine succeeds in forcing Russia backward, the world will witness aggression being punished, not rewarded. The struggle for Crimea may become one of the defining tests of whether international borders still carry meaning in the 21st century. And that may explain why Crimea increasingly feels less like a regional battlefield and more like the center of a global geopolitical reckoning. The most dangerous fortresses in history are often the ones that slowly trap the empires trying hardest to hold them. Throughout history, great empires have collapsed not from external defeat alone, but from overextension, economic exhaustion, and the endless burden of defending symbolic territories. Crimea now represents that same fatal danger for Russia. What began as a triumphant prize is turning into a bottomless sinkhole of resources, attention, and prestige. Crimea is no longer simply a military fortress. It is becoming a psychological and economic gravity well pulling more and more Russian resources into itself. Every ship, missile, and soldier sent to defend it drains strength from elsewhere. The more Putin clings to this blood-stained crown, the heavier the imperial burden becomes. A quiet exhaustion is setting in not just on the battlefield, but in the soul of the empire itself. And that may become the final paradox of Putin's blood-stained crown. Crimea may become both the beginning and the ending point of this entire war. The same Black Sea storms still rage against its cliffs. Missiles continue to streak from Sevastopol's shores, while Russian warships sit under constant threat in the fortified harbor. The peninsula remains a mythological fortress, yet its walls are now being tested not by direct assault, but by a silent, relentless chokehold. From the isolation of the Kerch Bridge and land corridors, through the drone hell in the skies, the economic burn of fuel depots, to the Kremlin's painful dilemma, the strategy is working. Ukraine is no longer fighting only with missiles, trenches, and artillery. It is fighting with logistics, economics, geography, and strategic exhaustion. General Ben Hodges may have understood something fundamental. The fastest way to destroy an empire's fortress is sometimes to force the empire to exhaust itself defending it. Crimea has become the alpha and omega of this conflict, a strategic black hole, a most significant naval strategic retreats in generations, a bitter reversal for a fleet once dominant in the region's symbolic center, and the place where imperial ambition may ultimately destroy itself. And perhaps that is why Crimea feels less like a battlefield tonight and more like the center of a historical turning point. If you want more deep geopolitical documentaries that go beyond headlines and uncover the systems, psychology, and strategic transformations reshaping modern warfare, stay with the channel. Because the next phase of this conflict may not be decided only by armies or missiles. It may be decided by which side learns to weaponize geography, logistics, and exhaustion more effectively than the other. And somewhere between the burning skies of Sevastopol and the collapsing illusion of imperial permanence, Crimea may already be deciding the future shape of global power itself.